Biennial. I'm specialized in Caribbean and Central America contemporary art. Today we are going to dedicate the session to the Caribbean, and the title is Rereading the Caribbean Emerging Cartography. We will be accompanied by a select group of professionals, art professionals, which I respect and admire. I hope this session will be a very fruitful session. This segment dedicated to Caribbean contemporary art within the biennial has its history or story. When we began thinking about what we can do on the anniversary of the biennial, which was inaugurated for the first time in 1984, the curatorship team of the biennial thought about the importance of in to have to invite Caribbean artists, but also to develop or draft a program, micro program, focus on the visual and theoretical events in the region. Within this program, we have individual exhibitions. We have an homage to a Dominican artist that died very young, Yolanda, and those accompanying me here will not let me lie when I say that he is one of the main reference of art in the region with an extraordinary production, particularly drawings and three-dimensional work. We are paying homage to this artist at the Wilfredo Lam Center, and those of you who have not visited the center, please do so. We have some independent participation of artists like the Moda Foca group from the Dominican Republic. We will also be dealing with films. We will be presenting some short films by Caribbean artists at the Wilfredo Lam Center. We will be paying homage to Antonio Marturell, and we will have the premiere of the documentary The Happy Accident, and of course this theoretical meeting that we are holding this morning. There is a background to this session. When I analyze the history of the Havana biennials, I am convinced of the coherence with which these biennials, or the first editions of the biennial, were organized. The first Havana biennial dedicated its symposium to the work of Wilfredo Lam, and in its second edition in 1986, the symposium was dedicated to plastic arts in the Caribbean with very important guests. They offered their views and opinions at the Convention Center, Havana Convention Center. 38 years later, we are here to rethink the Caribbean from different perspectives. That is why I am very much pleased to begin our morning session with Dr. Yolanda Wood, who is here to my left. Yolanda needs no introduction. Not here, not anywhere else. She is an extraordinary academic, very knowledgeable about the Caribbean art and Cuban art. However, I must say, or I will be reading a very brief summary about Yolanda. Yolanda is a professor, art historian, art critic. She is as a PhD in art science and full professor of the arts school on the University of Havana. She is a founder of a share in this university, the share of Caribbean Art Studies in 1985. She was also director of the Casa Las America Caribbean Central Study Center between 2006 and 2016. She has the ANSI Claxo Award 2009, the Jose Marti Grant in 2016, a postgraduate course in 2016. She has been professor in Ibero-American University and the Anahuac University in Mexico, and she's the author of several essays and books, among them about Cuban and Caribbean plastic art that was published in 1990. The Caribbean Visual Universe, Caribbean Islands Art Society and Nature. She is a frequent guest in the master degree courses and PhD courses. She has been member of juries in Cuba, in the region, and worldwide. Today, Yolanda will be make a presentation of Havana Biennial and a scenario for Caribbean contemporary art. And with this, I give Yolanda the floor. Thank you very much. Welcome and good morning. I want to thank your kind words and the acknowledgement of the work we carry out, a work that I have done jointly with you. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to do what we try to do regarding the biennials. Without this ongoing exchange to articulate our work and the work of our students with what was going on in the Havana Biennial, because we thought this was essential. Since its inception, you have been a key figure on this, and I thank you for your work during all these years. As it was announced, I'm going to talk about the different Havana biennials and why it was important regarding the Caribbean contemporary art. Scenarios for the contemporary Caribbean contemporary art. There are different meaning for the word scenario, and that is why I've used the word in plural, scenarios. They are understood as a context and environment, a place in una escena, un espacio expositor, performing arts for representations and dialogue, and can be understood as a space for discourse and knowledge with all the concerning dialogues and debates. This is a place where an event takes place, and this is what the 15 Havana biennials have been. We have been able to fulfill this goal throughout its 40 years of existence. This has been the case for the Caribbean arts. It has been the whole truth. I include the presence of Cuban artists also. how have this biennial have become an opportunity for Caribbean contemporary art to make their arts visible. The Havana Biennials, a place for action and context. In the last decade of the 20th century, a number of mega Caribbean art exhibitions took place as never before. They showed the complicated dynamic for countries marginalized from international centers and the controversial debate at the international level. I'm going to highlight four mega exhibitions. 1992 in Paris, France, where 109 artists participated and 119 Caribbean works, 74 of which were from 1990-1991, which were updated works, or the curatorship of these works were done in the Caribbean countries themselves, and this contributed to a network of communication between agents and organizations that mobilized these exhibitions, which was unprecedented. In 1994, we have a Karivish cohort in Germany where we had 50 artists, and the most outstanding works were from Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Of the 88 works, 74 belong to 1990 and 1994. This exhibition was curated by Alatad, who was present at the Havana Biennial and the Santo Domingo Biennial. 1995, Caribbean Vision, Miami, Florida, United States. As you can see, the English-speaking Caribbean prevailed, and the presence of migrants in the United States from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Haiti. Except Wilfredo Lam, all Cubans participating were living in the United States. In 1998, we had the Caribbean islands, include Exclusion, Fragmentation, and Paradise in Extremadura, Spain. The curator was Maria Luisa Borras, a very coherent exhibition. Maria Luisa was also at the Havana Biennial and the Dominican Republic Biennial. Selection of artists, quality of text, and the most recent works were exhibited. So in 6 years before the end of the 20th century, these mega exhibition exhibited the work of more than 100 Caribbean artists in different parts of Europe and the United States. However, it's important to highlight that at the time of these exhibitions, more than 10 editions of the Puerto Rico graving editions had taken place, four editions of the Havana Biennial, and of course the artistic work of the Caribbean islands in the 1990s, and the Caribbean and Central American Art Biennial in Dominican Republic. This means that all these mega exhibitions were done by non-Caribbean curators, and in all those biennials and exhibition, there was a platform for projects of Caribbean artists. That is why I say these exhibitions were the result of an endogenous process in the Caribbean islands that had a repercussion in these mega exhibitions in Europe and the United States. At the beginning of the new millennium, there was no increase in the number of countries and artists of the participating in Havana biennials, but there was a very important event, the increasing diversification of artistic manifestations like photography, videos, installations, performances, public interventions, design, with which were more selective in terms of the participants. You can see here the participation still the ninth edition and the presence of women that was reduced with time. I think this exhibition of Caribbean women artists that we are presenting in this biennial is very important. In the Caribbean, there were new events, like, for example, the organization of a biennial in Jamaica. Haiti created the Ghetto Biennial that is still in place today. Aruba held the first biennial encounter of the Caribbean in 2012, and there was an international biennial of contemporary art of Martinica in 2013. A very intense panorama where that can be a source of study for young students. I want to call your attention regarding the different mega exhibitions that followed. Some of them had Caribbean artists and creators as curators, like the case of Caribbean, Ocean Caribbean or Oceanic Caribbean, which was curated by a Mexican curator. What I would like to mention now is the fact that the biennials have been a space that have marked the pace of change in the artistic production of the region. As an exhibition space, biennials have provided a wide catalog of works and artists of the Caribbean. The selection for these biennials was a very responsible and intense work. It was done in teamwork, as always, with important personalities like Jose Manuel Noceda, who has worked very hard in selecting the participants in the biennials. The events showed a multi-generational phenomena, which I believe is very important to study if we take into consideration that this was paying historical debts with persons who were not well known, not in the Caribbean nor worldwide, like Philly Moore from Guyana, or Leon Castro, and Susi de Pellerano from Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, respectively, just to mention a few. They were participants of the early Havana biennials, and this is also important to know how the biennial came to visualize artists that were not known internationally. The first biennial, the Boricua graphic prevailed in the exhibitions from the Caribbean. This shows the cohesion of that movement of the last half of the last century. After the second biennial, as I said, the artistic formats were diversified, particularly with installations and performances. In this regard, I would like to highlight big moments of the biennials, like the exhibition of Francisco Cabral from Trinidad and Tobago. That exhibition was a jewel. The works of Tony Capillan, dear friend artist who has passed away from Dominican Republic, and the Rafta artists from Barbados that for the first time were participating in this biennials. Key moment were the five Chariots for the History by Marco Lora Ritz, a Dominican artist. Maria de los Ángeles Pereira was also addressing the juxtaposition of Caribbean art in in the region. With the fifth Havana Biennial, we had new trends for Caribbean arts. The focus was propitious for decolonial and critical exhibitions. The topic at the time was art, society, reflection. The Caribbean participation included 24 artists and was enriched with the presence for the first time of countries like Aruba, Bahamas, Curacao. This is Chubi Quirindongo's work that was exhibited here at the National Museum. Artists that never before had participated in international events of this dimension. We had a very important work, the work of Anaida Hernandez with her piece Till Death Do Us Part, which was part of the women artists that are present in this biennial. This work was in one of the areas of interest of the biennial, the power relations in the art field from a critical and social perspective. This was the text of the biennial documents. What did the artist do? She installed a memorial of women who have died due to domestic violence between 1990 and 1993 in Puerto Rico, despite the fact that in 1989 a law on the prevention and intervention against domestic violence had been passed. Maybe because of this, the first presentation of this work was at the Capitol Hill in Puerto Rico, and the artist was interested in making a public act the names of these 100 women that had been murdered was personalized. They included their date of birth. The work was very much publicized, and there were niche with symbols regarding the violence they had suffered, expressed with images, words, flowers, crucifix, and other daily objects. Maldonado understood this was an effective conceptual work, evoking these women. Another fundamental trend and the presence of Caribbean artists in these biennials is to link art with life. These are ideas that are reinforced with these images. This was what happened with Alora Calzadilla, her macro photographies in the Havana public spaces, or the work of Barbara Preso. And huge work that was installed at the Morro Castle. These were things that were brought, they were things from the real world. This was no invention. These were objects we use every day in our life. Or when Ryan Odubers from Aruba brought this cream, it was a new fashion, the artist said. And this was the title because they wanted to recognize the different cameras that follow us throughout the city and public spaces. The photographic collation of Javier from Trinidad and Tobago was also a jewel. At the time, it was related to the Back to Africa theme and the shipping company created by Marcus Garbis. He showed photographs of the lives of Afro-descendant communities settled in the Central American territories. Many of the works we have seen in the Havana biennials generated an important exchange called discussing realities and contexts. Jean-François Beauclerk has shown in his works playing with fans, airs, and banners or flags. We also come from that tradition of the red, blue, and white colors for the flag, the language of the Haitian living in Germany, through Desert, with these pages associated to his trajectory living in Germany and dressing up like an American, or the work of Raúl Recio, the Dominican, an important installation regarding migration conflicts of the island, and the work for the Caribbean contemporary art by the Champu Group. An extraordinary piece showing displacement through the Mona Canal. Two works are very important in discussing realities and contexts. The work of Polibio Diaz, Dominican great friend, who has participated in different biennials, the Treasure Island, and the one by Anna Davis, Just Beyond My Imagination. This is a unique installation, the first we saw, with a critical positioning, with political intentions on environment. That island that you see there, that you could see from Bolivia's balcony. Imagine that I wake up and see that monument of islands just in front of me. He began his work as a political and intellectual activist, a committed political and intellectual activist. This work by Anali Davis, who was also invited and is part of the exhibition, is a floor installation. It simulated the Caribbean Sea as it is happening in many of our countries. A golf course was translated into the Caribbean Sea. Another important aspect is the construction of subjectivities, understanding these subjective and affective spaces. This was shown in this work of the Puerto Rican residing in the Bronx, a great social worker Pepon Osorio, as Marturell says, is a person who enjoys what he does. He does what he does with great passion, marked by his Boricua nature. This Boricua resident in the United States, as well as Elvis Lopez. Elvis is an extraordinary character in construing identities. This piece, Amnesia, was exhibited at the Havana Biennial and had a great impact. And the great artist that Jorge Pineda, who passed away, with this work, Inner Garden or Interior Garden, a beautiful piece on the idea of construing subjectivities. Pineda said arts like Sorry for Children is important to discover our inner thoughts. We find fairy uh, that are hidden in our daily labyrinth. Or pieces like the Jamaican Albert Shawn, who resides also in the United States, or Ernesto Leres from Martinique, that we were seeing to the right, the previous slide, to think about the existence of the subject and subjectivities in modern times. Another important field of reflection of these biennials that have greatly contributed to the Caribbean contemporary art are the gender debate that have been part of the exhibitions as revealed by the participation of Raquel Payevonsky of Dominican Republic, interested on the female body, and our dear Belkis Ramirez, who also passed away, who focused on this topic and presented this piece, this installation, or Alida Martinez present here, who has a piece on called Roots, revealing other aspects of discourses related to materiality, beliefs, and ethnic and intercultural topics. This has been very important in the Caribbean contemporary art. This piece was, I couldn't find the piece in the catalog. This was a piece that was exhibited at the Plaza de Armas with a strong Buddhist sense, or the work of Marcel Pinas from Suriname, aimed at memories and the meaning of cultural objects in Suriname. I couldn't find the photograph of the piece he exhibited at the Havana Biennial. Now I'm going to refer to gestures and body language in the artistic work of the region. This is a work of Joel in Havana. He carried water to help the community in Old Havana, or Rafael Treyes' work in a Cuban community representing his people and his daily world on the walls of that community. And in a Boricua neighborhood, he made the neighbors participate in a work called El Cerro, or Robert Stevenson from Jamaica with his panoramic vision of informal markets in Port-au-Prince city. This is the general dynamic where we saw new perspective in terms of relations with the audience. This was obvious at the Museum of Nicolas Dumi, and the presence of Peter Mitchell, who was a great event at the Havana Biennial with the carnivals in Trinidad and Tobago, and Antonio Martorell's projection, which were part of all this project in the experimental field and used as exhibition scenarios in dialogue with the audience or the public, which is to build identity, which is something essential in Antonio Martorell's work. I conclude referring to biennials as a space for knowledge and for discourse. This was of great interest for critical studies on the Caribbean. We can't imagine how much biennials have contributed to critical studies regarding Caribbean art. We have been able to do all this thanks to the fact that contemporary art was also being made at the Havana Biennial. And those multiple scenarios were the ones who helped us because all the catalogs of these exhibitions are a documentary, essential documentary source that we did not have in the region. Here we have the names and in different countries, approaches, Caribbean voices. We have the first specialized magazines in plastic art like Arte Cubano, Cariforo, the cultural magazine for plastic arts, Astema, Arte TCD in Dominican Republic, very prestigious and internationally renowned magazines dedicated full articles on Caribbean contemporary art like Atlanta. We have to recall Dear Antonio or Renoir, who dedicated a full edition to Caribbean contemporary art. There was a compilation of texts, artists narrating their own experiences for curatorial work in the region. We had the first website on Caribbean art called Arising from France, and that included galleries, artistic galleries, texts from different countries. The first digital magazines on Caribbean art were launched, Visión Doble in Puerto Rico, or Arte América of Casa de las Américas in Cuba. Not to mention the websites that we have today from almost all artists in the region that make information flow that 10, 15 years back we did not have. All young students interested in this have a source in this with a process that started 40 years ago. All these projections show the contrast in the contemporary Caribbean. There are many documents to discuss, to reflect on the insertion of Caribbean art in the dissemination of sources and reference worldwide with different nature. Today, as we have said, at the Havana University, we will be celebrating the 19th anniversary of our art department and of the first Caribbean Studies Share, Caribbean Art Studies Share. And 2 years ago, we had the first master degree on visual art of the Caribbean in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I was invited to advance the first PhD on art, cultural art and thinking in the Caribbean that will start in September next year. The biennial scenario has been a learning lab for our university students, for our undergraduates that are always interested in this subject, of which I have been a professor for many years. This gives continuity and follow-up to all these studies. All my books and artwork and works have been donated to the university so that these studies remain and contribute to the knowledge of future generations. This Caribbean contribution has become a professional exercise and a praxis for undergraduate research. We have created a multimedia that cover up to the ninth Havana Biennial. This was done with our students, and there is a compilation of data with very important results. We have had many theses, master degree theses that have been part of the biennial scenario, and the research, the ongoing research in the art department on the presence and participation of Caribbean artists in biennials. So when we close the 15th Havana Biennial on February next year, it will continue in our academy. It continues to be alive in the study process and research. So I conclude saying that the Havana Biennials have developed networks that have made the look of the Caribbean artists more secure. These events for creators, critics, curators, and commissioners of the regional and international area has contributed to launching projects that have established connections with other Caribbean regions, both island countries and continental countries in the Caribbean and outside the Caribbean. Long live the Havana Biennial. Happy anniversary.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Yolanda, for this remarkable summary of what the biennial has meant for the Caribbean and what the Caribbean has meant for the biennial. Yolanda has forced me to abandon my planned script. I intentionally did not include what she mentioned in the exhibition that we have at the Wilfredo Center. We have counted on the cooperation of the museum and the University of Arts because I knew that she was going to mention some Caribbean women artists that have been involved in the biennials throughout its history. Here in the building of Universal Art, we have an exhibition that is called Tradition. It is difficult to maintain tradition, and this is a quote by Leo Brouwer, which we consider is valid and relevant for us curators, Jorge Fernandez and myself. So I was going to leave for the end of Yolanda's presentation a little commercial about this project. We're talking about 17 female Caribbean artists. She mentioned some of them who are indispensable references for the curatorship of the project. Some of them are here: Elsa Maria Melendez, Jamie Lois, Elsa from Puerto Rico, Jamie Lois from Trinidad and Tobago, Jocelyn Garner from Barbados, and Baron Bell from the U.S. Virgin Islands. 17 Caribbean female artists from 10 Caribbean countries, including the French Guiana. Tabita Resaide, a very sophisticated artist of French origin, but whose origins is in the French Guiana. And I wanted to leave it to the end because before I open the floor for your questions and comments, I wanted to listen to Yolanda's opinion on the following. I think that symbolic constructs, Yolanda, developed by female artists in the Caribbean have significantly evolved throughout time. While these women all have a similar input in the feminist discourse throughout the years, in the female sensitivity in their own life experiences and stories and their own family histories and background, I think they all, or most of the female artists displayed in this exhibition and others that unfortunately we were unable to bring their work due to space restrictions, are disrupting all the scenarios around them. I think they are artists which we cannot label, who are not only concerned with women-related issues in the Caribbean today, but actually their work goes beyond that. And they are researchers, screeners who go through the cracks of mainstream discourses and dismantle the historical alibis of the Caribbean from various perspectives. So I would like to listen to your views. I fully agree with what you've said, and I think, as I've already said, when you quantify the biennials to make an assessment, we need the numbers, the data. Sometimes it is difficult, and then you can complete it with the symbolic construction that you were referring to. We noted a decrease in the number of the participation of female artists in biennials in the 21st century, and then the number began to increase. But there's this exhibition is justice to female artists in the Caribbean. And I wanted to highlight, in addition to this disruption of patterns of traditionality in visual arts and in the use of materials, in the use of crafts as a key element in their creation processes, which is validating local historical traditions that we've inherited from our grandmothers, from our traditional cuisine that go back to the times of slavery and enslaved women, like Jocelyn Garvey throughout her work, that has a strong imprint of these topics, a reassessment of history and of the place and role of women in history. And I want to highlight something that I consider crucial, that most of these women whose work we are now exhibiting and who are representatives of the current trends of art in the Caribbean are creators, and this has to do with the condition of women. Women create life, women create culture, and this has to do with a matrix that goes beyond art, is a matrix of our own nature as human beings. So I think that is revealing. Women who are involved, engaged, who stand out in their daily work. And when we look in our own classrooms, and this is important for students to understand, students of these topics, we are mostly women in our classroom. What does that mean? That means something. That means something that is deep and has to do with this ability of manage of women, breaking away from the traditional roles of women who have to stay home, keep quiet, and sit with arms crossed. This is a rupture of a dynamic of power that has been legitimized throughout time, and we should disrupt all that in all areas, in education, at institutional level, in writing, in our literature. That is crucial. Many a times we neglect some areas, but we women, not only because we're women, but you have been brought up within a set of values. Some you need to break away from, others you need to reaffirm. And this sense of tradition is palpable in the work of many female artists. I want to highlight Barbara Presto, who's no longer with us. I think that this work of weaving, which and hair braids, that is accompanied by the voices of those women and the testimonies. And when I was going to write the words for her catalog, I resorted to a woman who I knew was engaged in this topic, our dear Puerto Rican friend, and I quote her in my text because braiding is a collective act, is an emotional act. I now have a Mapuche student in Mexico, in my classroom in Mexico, and she said that she wanted to come with her braids to my exhibition, but I don't know who can braid my hair. Do you know someone who can do my braids? And I said, no, I have no clue, but let's find someone. I shouldn't braid my own hair. Somebody should braid my hair. And there's communication involved there. There's braiding your hair is part of a tradition of communication, like in indigenous peoples and in African peoples. So I want to highlight this creativity, breaking away from patterns and the traditional role that women were supposed to play in a role, but also management, creating women in the spaces of culture and institutions and cooperation in artistic creation. And I, as a professor, as a curator, we have Alida who dared organizing a biennial in Aruba, and that was remarkable. She organized it with you as a curator, and it was remarkable work we were able to see there when Alida dared to organize the first biennial in Aruba, a biennial meeting with a rather controversial concept, but a very original one in 2012. Yes, we are creators and managers. We should not be content with our traditional roles. We have to go beyond, and we must take the first step to change things according to our knowledge and our level of awareness. You need to know to do things. Otherwise, you won't be able to create things that last throughout time and are sustainable. Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments? Please come to one of the mics. And please introduce yourself. Good morning. I'm Dina Malot Allende Gonzalez. I am a researcher of the Hemispheric Studies U.S. Research Center of the University of Havana. The first thing is I want to thank Professor Yolanda for her wonderful presentation, which at least in my view, or I have not only enjoyed it, but I have found and learned about actions linked to the biennial and not necessarily linked to the history of biennials, which I didn't know of. And particularly about one of the topics you touched upon during your presentation I wanted to refer to. You talked about a number of exhibitions, mega exhibitions from the 1990s, and if my memory serves me right, the last one was in 1998, and I was very much interested to the reference you made to the exhibition in Miami in 1994, where you said a number of artists were invited, but you said that the only one who did not live in the US, he was deceased, of course, but all of them were Cuban artists living abroad. And I want to refer to this because I'm going to refer to something that came to my mind. Back in 1994, as you know, was a year very important in the relationship of the US with Latin America for two main reasons. First, in January, the ratification of the NAFTA, and the second that took place in Miami was in December, was the first summit of the Americas, and this is something I want to refer to very briefly so I can ask a question. And this had a chapter devoted to culture, which was held in mid-1994 in Maryland, and it was called A New Time for Our America, and several Latin American and Caribbean intellectuals were invited, and I will mention 5 names. Robert Lakin, who was the editor of the volume compiling those presentations, which is called A New Time in Our America. That was the name of the event and of the book. Sergio Ramirez from Nicaragua. Francis Fukuyama, the famous man of the end of history, and by Cuba, 2 intellectuals who did not live in Cuba, Alberto Padilla, Marilena Cruz Varela. Now, considering this detail, we could consider it as a cultural chapter that one way or the other, because it was explicit. Actually, who made the opening remarks was Albert Gore, as Vice President of the U.S. at the time. He was the keynote speaker. I have the feeling that this exhibition you refer to could, in one way or the other, be connected to all the events and the Summit of the Americas represented, where all Latin American and Caribbean countries were invited, excepting Cuba. If possible, I will answer very briefly, and I apologize. If my presentation moved you to think about all this based on my presentation about this exhibition, I thank you, first of all, for the fact that you're here, for being interested in learning more about these topics, and for realizing that we have different and multidisciplinary visions. I am glad for your reply. I didn't know that exhibition had taken place, and I was not aware. I have a hard time believing in coincidences. That is why biennials in a context. These were very difficult times. The biennial is celebrating its 40th anniversary, and of course, it has faced very difficult times of contemporary history that were complex and critical. I cannot give you any more details, but I thank you for your comments, and I'm very glad that you, an expert in U.S. politics, were able to react to my presentation. Thank you very much. I would like to add something, Yolanda, that perhaps can clarify the concern of our friend. Curating is a very complex process, and what lies behind is also very complex. This exhibition was very controversial at the time. First of all, curatorship was done actually from Jamaica, from the English-speaking Caribbean, and there were serious contradictions, not only in the case of Cuba. Perhaps we need to research more deeply in what happened and what gave rise to that project. And if my memory serves me right, the Dutch-speaking Caribbean was also excluded. Not only the Cuban art from an artist from living in Ireland were included, English-speaking Caribbean artists were privileged because the curators came from the English-speaking Caribbean, and language is another barrier we face in the Caribbean. This was a very controversial exhibition. It was a very good exhibition. Don't get me wrong. It was certainly a leap forward in the dissemination of contemporary art of the Caribbean of the first half of the 1990s. That was continued with the island Caribbean art fragmentation, exclusion, etc. But that was a best and conceived exhibition that did include artists from all the Caribbean, and all those catalogs are in the library of the university, available for all of you to consult. You can check all those catalogs, and soon we are planning to have them online for you to consult. Yolanda's presentation was very lengthy. I did not want to stop her, and I allowed her to use more of the time allowed her for her presentation, so we're lagging behind schedule. So I kindly ask you to please move on to the second presentation of this morning. Yolanda, on behalf of the Center of the Biennial of Jorge Fernandez, of the Fine Arts Museum, of the organizing team, of Jaima, Camila, and everybody else who has made this event possible. I deeply appreciate your presence, and especially for opening today's session, in which we will be discussing contemporary art in the Caribbean. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Bueno, continuamos.
We now continue with a video by Dr. Carlos Garrido Castellanos, another connoisseur of our Caribbean contemporary art history. Carlos was unable to join us, but we will first listen to his previously recorded presentation, and then he will join us online in case you wish to ask him any questions and make any comments. Carlos is a professor and lecturer of the University of Ireland, where he coordinates a bachelor program in Portuguese studies. He is an associate researcher and visual identities in art and design of the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He is the author of several books and essays on the Caribbean and other regions of the global South. He joined us once in a research residency for 3 months a few years ago. He came, and he's a profound connoisseur of contemporary art of the entire Caribbean. He has, throughout his years of research, he has a remarkable database of artists and events in the Caribbean, and that's why we thought it was timely to invite him to make a presentation today. Without further ado, I ask the organizers to please play Carla's video, and then we will try to talk to him online. I am very proud for being able to participate in the celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Biennial of Havana. I would like to now reflect about all these issues, and I would have loved to join you, but unfortunately I am unable to join you. I would like to highlight the open character of contemporary art, a character that makes it possible to adjust to diverse cultural and social phenomena, and also, and this is very important, and I think what kind of life can live and survive in capitalism. This defines the fungi and mushrooms that emerge or sprout at the end of the earth. This mushroom that springs when it's called Matsutake, and the interest of various human groups like sellers, buyers. This is unintelligible if you don't include other animal and vegetable species that are constantly interacting.
En continuo cambio. Por tanto, crean una
And we will coexist, and we must be coexist peacefully. This allows us to respond to a context and future projects that were thought of. So the thing is how we can live once capitalism fails and we are supposed to subsist in the ruins of capitalism. We need to maximize the implementation of capitalism in other contexts, universalizing its results. Finances and life management are the priorities of capitalism. These standards are more than the mere sum of its parts. The key attribute of these groups is contamination through collaboration, the will to remain open to the influence of other forms of life as an alternative to survive to a system and a planet in ruin. Singh talking about mushrooms. The role of biennials often ignore collective survival contamination processes, and I will elaborate. For decades, the biennial was held as a pioneer and disseminating art of the global South. You cannot object to this principle. This has been proven. I don't want to oppose one alternative explanation to erase decades of analysis. I think we need to supplement our perception of a project that has gone beyond the fundamental work of opposing globalization from the South to the globalization of the North, the role of the biennial should go beyond that. I firmly believe that part of the problem we face has to do with the belief that cultural criticism is to reinterpret the meaning of things, but actually we should have a collaborative pattern like Singh has described, not to break away from what is existing, but to expand and translate it into different ways and unforeseen directions. There's no doubt the biennial was a turning point for the world of arts and for a more sustainable and shared world. The main idea I want to launch here has to do with the fact that this version of history is not the only version of history. There are more ideas and hypotheses. The Havana Biennial was able to go beyond the globalization and reinvented ways to look at things and go beyond the horizons of globalization. And this is today more indispensable than ever. There's always a discussion about the term of global, understood as exchange and interconnection of markets, free flow of people and goods, etc. The discussion about the global is ultimately restrictive as well. The truth is that we have signs that we no longer live in a globalized world for several reasons, mainly due to the isolation from neoconservative models imposed by the right that take us back to the closing of borders, at least in social political terms, and we're seeing a comeback to the planetary world and awareness of the end of the planet, and therefore we need to involve other species that go beyond the history of human life. So in this system, creativity is not a mere or exclusively a human thing. So what version of globalization we want to choose, but actually the important thing is that we are seeing the end of the globalized world. The political, the social, and the real thing don't necessarily go together. We should go beyond creating a new assemblage and new contaminations, and we have to see how we will subsist in the ruins of the globalized and colonial and capitalist world. In this vision of the biennial, I think it is relevant to rethink the history of the biennial, which was not one single history that is closely intertwined with the history of arts in the Caribbean, but we should go beyond neoliberalism and the urgency of any crisis. I consider that the history of biennial includes and comprises several histories, and today it is very important to come up with an alternative strategy to come up with new forms of common forms of life. So we need to rethink the future of the biennial. We must think of the multiple genealogy that the biennial help advance. I think would like to come up with some. I would like to highlight some alternatives proposed by the biennial, and we will be able to. I'm afraid that I won't have enough time to elaborate. So then, in the Q&A, we could go deeper into any issue of your interest. Therefore, as I said, the history of the biennial comprises several histories which are crucial not only to understand the future of this project, the future of curatorship, but future in general as a full stop and a turning point for the future. And I will share some ideas and some of the most interesting elements as an alternative genealogy that should work beyond the global. Perhaps one of the key elements that is clearly evident when we talk about the biennial to raise the visibility of art from the global south is the ability of the biennial to change with the times and to showcase artists that are not only focused in the distribution of art and the market of art, but to disseminate the art of local communities. So I want to think the biennials is a catalyzer of social projects that find in art a way to express themselves and also to create convergence that in other fora would be impossible. And the biennial, from the very beginning, not only brought together artists from several countries, which is the traditional format of biennials, but changed the purpose of biennials themselves. And the 20, 30 years of the history of the Caribbean could not be understood if we don't think about these spontaneous coalitions and networks that simply emerged in the gatherings facilitated by the biennial. So I'm not only interested in thinking about art itself, how art is showcased and discussed, but I also like to think that when everything is happening, there is an assemblage and spontaneous networks and partnerships and links are established that go beyond art itself and bring closer people that otherwise would never meet or will have any contact with the world of contemporary art, which I still find to be rather closed and elitist. And biennial open doors that go beyond contemporary art, beyond the globalization of contemporary art, and that from the beginning question who globalizes who's being globalized, and what is the result of all exchanges and interactions, and decide to operate on several scales, which is something that today is taken for granted, and something that today is more common, but it wasn't several years ago. And this is a key example of a major contribution, a positive contribution, which goes beyond, and that is seldom explained and cannot only be explained by the notion of globalization. I always think about the slow time of some of the organization of the works of the 1990s, because to exhibit works challenge the walls of contemporary art, where they were focusing in the rapid dissemination of culture. The biennials are focus on the exponential growth, and the more we advance and as time passes, we should have more biennials, and more biennials should be more similar. But I want to question this. There are several examples to prove that the time of making art and sharing art questions one of the more serious and major limitations of globalization, understood as mercantilization of production, and that global contemporary art should be only based in an accelerated growth and a dissemination of art. I've always seen as the Havana Biennial as a dense space that cannot be easily summed up by some of paradigmatic works. I'm also astonished by the ability of the biennial to replicate and promoting the assemblage, and also promoting the emergence of similar biennials in the Caribbean region. In my work in the last decade, I'm focusing on working on activist art and social practice. There are some diverse theories, and on the other hand, there's like a normalization or standardization of a discussion that is based in a false assumption that fully committed art should be a consequence of artistic experimentation of the European and first world vanguard, and that is a false assumption, because we can think about activism and activist art. I think it is impossible to discuss all these issues without considering the importance of the anti-colonial movement in the political and cultural praxis and in theory, when trying to establish not only new ways of doing and creating, but opening up new horizons for people living in these contexts. So I think this is a crucial discussion that is open. And one of the main arguments I've always emphasized is that things usually happen and then are talked about and labeled. So practice advances more rapidly than theory, and this is important. The terms that are used, and I include myself in these phenomenon, terms and labels usually are created and standardized in English. But praxis goes beyond and advances more rapidly than theory, and we should not focus ourselves in labels and terms and the universalization of these labels and terms. Actually, instead of facilitating the debate, make it more difficult and elitist. Artists think through praxis and think in combination with several other activities that not necessarily are considered part of the cultural scenarios. So when we consider the history and alternative genealogy of the biennial, which do not contradict the globalization from the global south, make it urgent. We should not look at the past as something that has already happened, but that will help us shape our future and alternative futures for the biennial, but for our nations and our world in general. Another element has to do with power and potentiality, not only to reinterpret artistic praxis, but to establish synergies and partnerships that might seem obvious and therefore should become an essential forum and space for our life and for activism that should go beyond activism, and that shouldn't have any objection to inserting itself in any and several existing scenarios and discussing with other currents. We have a lot to consider, a lot to think about, both about the past and the present of the biennials. And we should go from a monumental scale and finding a truly worldwide dimension of art. It is surprising to see that artistic communities, local or communities of artists and foreign artists are interested in taking part in the biennials. This is astonishing because these strategies coexist with a generalized and mainstream discourse but this should be part of human nature. Innovation is here and it breaks and disrupts the status quo. And today, this has become more normal and reaches a broader audience, but 20, 30 years ago, this was not as natural.
We need to combine different artistic praxis with a process of reinsertion and natural environments to give spaces to communities to develop their energy that survive their own artistic projects. Today, this could be more common. But if we analyze the genealogy of these biennials, I think in the case of the Havana Biennial, it has been there. We need to see other ways of analyzing and thinking. These three elements would become more familiar for any person interested in contemporary art in the next decade. I won't discuss if in the past we talk about futurism, realism, etc., which I don't believe, or if these are practices and ways of doing things that have been standardized and have lost their relation. I have my view on this, but I want to focus on something else, dealing with the singularity of these values, but how they were conceived and tested in terms of the global project. The biennial go beyond the artistic aspect, and though we find it in the global art, cannot be restricted to this genealogy. And I said this to understand not only the past, but to think and rethink what the art can do in the near future, marked by the collapse of the whole planet. If we assume this starting point, that the Caribbean art and the curatorial work of the biennial anticipated ways of living, ways of challenging the limitations of artistic projects, we will be doing something more important than a historical analysis. So it's not a problem of reinventing history and saying this is valid, this is not valid. As I say, to think about the future 40 years after the first biennial, when the future in general is quite uncertain today. And now that I mentioned project, the globalization project is collapsing before our eyes. So we need to find alternatives. So my intervention should serve to remind us that that search began some decades ago and that there is a lot of rescue. Greet you and listen to your presentation. You were the second presentation of this second day of the Havana Biennial, dedicated to the Caribbean contemporary art and its circuits. Yolanda was the first speaker, and I think her presentation is very much related to what you have presented. I think there is great complementarity between both presentations. I would like to open now a Q&A session regarding the topic of Carlos' presentation. Is there somebody who would like to ask or say something? Are there any questions, comments? I would like Carlos to go a little bit beyond the Havana Biennial. You know very well the international scenarios for contemporary art. You have talked about harmonization processes. I remember that Nixon at the second Havana Biennial talked about the biennial as a life lab. Amidst all these adverse scenarios characteristic of globalization, what other correlates to the Havana Biennial can we find today? Well, thank you for the question. I'm very happy to be in present, though I'm not there in person. It is. Suleiman. I have friends, long-time friends, and it's a pleasure for me to participate in this. I think for me, we need to think that the system of biennial proliferation, not the biennial itself, because there is a biennial format. It has the expectation of creating a framework. When I accepted the challenge of thinking with you about this, had to do with trying to see what anticipates the Havana Biennial, what are the backgrounds in the 1980s that today may be affordable to many audiences and publics. This it's not only a problem of producing and consuming. I think that is present and it's a continuity that we can save. I'm not much interested in criticizing the contradictions of this global model, but to say that there were several models and many of them are revealing themselves today. Consumption is going slower. The idea of moving away from spectacularity to invest in management so that the biennial is not a parenthesis in the calendar year, and it should be a resource fundamental for the future, what we can do for art in the next years. Thank you, Carlos. Somebody would like to make a comment or a question or a remark? Well, Carlos, we are appreciate very much and we thank you very much for dedicating your time. Well, there's somebody who wants to make to say something. Please state your name. Good morning. Thank you. I'm Adriana Rios. I'm an artist and curator from Cali, Colombia. I want to share more than a question. I was talking with my colleague Ana Maria Lozano. The Carlos' last phrase that remembered me about the fact that how artists will assume climate change or these type of events. We have just held the COP16 in Cali and focus on biodiversity. And I remember there was a very beautiful event between artist in Cali and a scientist in Cali. The scientist was a marine biologist, a very important person for the environment, and she said, governments, institutions don't listen to us, so we need to give artists the responsibility to disseminate this. It was something called like biotics, symbiotic science or something like that. It was like talking among ourselves of what were the needs from one side and the other. So I wanted to make this comment from a very small region but very rich in biodiversity to nationals sat down to talk about how we are going to do this. And of course, this is something that is just starting. We need to listen to a wide number of people. Saying global is very rare, but there is a structure or something that is going on and we have to join it. What scientists are saying is very sad and they are giving us a responsibility. That is what I wanted to comment. Yes, can I comment? Yes, well, thank you for the comment. I'm a huge fan of chaotic things, and I think this is a field where debate and human debate and research is what makes us move forward. I just finished reading an essay from Juan Cardenas, Colombian writer, who talks how the environmental crisis is, Juan Carlos says, that within the Afro-Colombian and indigenous Colombian population, this is something, this is important. This is not only a problem of scientists and politicians. If I ask 8-year-old children to give me an answer, science, I believe that we have a lot to win if we try to challenge this chaos and this is a legacy that we have and we need to work on this. Very good, Carlos. Well, once again, thank you very much. I think you're, oh, well, there is somebody else who wants to take the floor. Roberto Medina from the Havana University. You established a principle, an holocaustic principle in terms of the transformation of the current society. And I think you suggested that art somehow gave us the potential of approaching wide audiences because we bring a new form of knowledge. The globalization elements I always think are quite stereotype. These globalization actually is more than a ghost. It's more a ghost that articulates and promotes the fragmentation of contemporary society. And we have groups that are emerging. There is no totalizing globalization that is false. Actually, parallel to this, we have fragmentation processes and the emergence of many possibilities to analyze other perspectives and alternatives. So, in this regard, I think, well, it's my impression that you suggest that art in itself, contemporary art, has become a sort of catalyzer or possibilities to reach very wide audiences that, unlike the language of politics or scientists, are nearer to the human being. Art generates this type of approach. We need to develop these alternative voices that analyze things in many different ways. It's not the global speeches, or we need more affectionate discourse nearer to the human being. So art is generating a new vision that reaches more people and can be a catalyzer for a new world consciousness where particularities have a value. That is my view. Thank you. Something else you would like to say, Carlos? My main interest with this presentation is that justice has not been done to the main contribution of biennials, and in particular the Havana biennials, the way we understand decolonization. And my main argument is that biennials are more than that. That rich history cannot be reduced to just one history, because that is already our past, it's not our present. Ghosts, though they do not exist, they make people afraid and people react to ghosts. So be it a ghost or not, globalization is something of the past. And I think the tools and most valuable resources for creating something positive and capable of transforming things is already in the agendas of these biennials. Thank you, Carlos. I think your presentation is linked to what we have been discussing today and with the concepts that have been dealt with, the categories and reflections that were also expressed in the first day of the theoretical event. I think you have placed on the table aspects that make us think, particularly about the future. I think that the next speaker, Haider Orsini from Colombia, will also be very much in line from another perspective, not only from based on the Havana Biennial, but based on the social practices that you have mentioned. It has been a pleasure to listen to your presentation, to see you, and to have you as part of our session today. Thank you. Let's put our hands together for Carlos. Success. Now, I will call Haider Orsini. I just mentioned him. Welcome, Haider. He's a well-known friend. He has been several times in Havana. Haider is a curator. He's contemporary art management. He lives and works in Barranquilla, Colombia. He trained as a bachelor in arts and folklore at the University of El Cesar in Valledupar. He did a master degree in the National University of Colombia in San Andres. His main focus is to collect reflections and critiques on landscape, territories, and decolonial community practices. He is a curator of contemporary art in Plataforma Carnival artistic space, among other things that he does. And he will be talking about community curatorship. Welcome once again, Haider, and you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you. I thank Jorge Fernandez for the invitation and the biennial team that makes possible all this. Thank you. I'm going to talk about community curatorship because I'm interested on the idea of going beyond. I've always thought about the Caribbean as something beyond. For me, the Caribbean is a place that expands throughout geography and the bodies that inhabit it, that there is a synergy that moves it constantly and makes it a place beyond what we can imagine and think. And community curatorship, I want to mention a list of projects and spaces for rebuilding the community concept because I think that in the community concept we will be able to find the colonial identities within the Caribbean and what we have discussed here about economy and the globalization project. And I think, and there is something that has called my attention, and that is to see how community productions are inserted within contemporary art as creative identities. They have been able to create communities but not community processes, and this also is also linked to the colonial uh, this colonial project based on time and space that organized and sought or pursued a civilizatory process conceived the construction of a community. And in the community, we have rules. We have to follow rules. Every organization has to follow rules. And in this case, the community pursued to find another sense when globalization appeared. It seemed that the integration of the world actually gave way to the fragmentation of the world. When the world was called to integrate itself through globalization, borders were closed because we were in the era of paradox. When the globalization concept was launched, the local concept was also launched. Any village could be global, of course, through internet. And in places where there were no internet, it was after the great explosion of the digital world. And still there are many places where there is no coverage. And this has to do with the community, the human community. This project, like all projects of the colonial technology, as I call it, organize communities that in the Caribbean have another sense. The community in the Caribbean is a construction of identity of the diasporas that play an important role in the construction of that imaginary collective it is constructed based on this geographic relation. And here we also have the Colombian Caribbean and Venezuelan Caribbean that are blind spots, and that is why we saw that with no ill intention, but just as part of life, we see that in Yolanda's presentation, we did not see the Venezuelan Caribbean and the Colombian Caribbean. The Great Caribbean and the community, there is a huge gap. The community is everything that is defined and known, and the community practice is what we don't know. So in constructing the community and the community actions, it's important to mention some projects in the Caribbean that have cannibalized those who mentioned talk those who talked yesterday about imperialism and anti-imperialism, that is are also abstract concepts. When we talk about imperialism, it's almost everything and nothing. And there is specific definition of struggles and the needs for which people organize themselves to struggle. That is why the community concept is not something common. It becomes a notion of chaos, and the Caribbean is due to community praxis and the chaos. So, the saying that we have to speak the same language to do this creates a disruption in the world. So the Caribbean is a place that you cannot grasp, that you cannot perceive. Though one of the first or second generation of thinkers of the Caribbean that are part of a decolonial project that talk, they wanted very much to define the Caribbean because there were this external pressure that wanted them to define the Caribbean. Cesar, Pano, Glissar, in that search, they had to define the Caribbean. This paved the way to understand that it was not necessary to define the Caribbean, that we did not need to be categorized or classified. And this built a thought platform and action platform in many parts of the Caribbean. And that is where the community concept or notion breaks. We have very powerful languages, we have body constructions or constructs that had been subjugated during colonial times, plantations, the plantation system. I have an article where I say that the body had the capacity to eat soft food. They were able to eat slavery, and that tobacco, cotton, sugar, banana, foods for which they had been subjected to the disappearance of the human being, they were able to eat all that and have or build a new condition with different community practices. So I would say that we have a climate of diversity in the community. We talk about diversity, but we don't understand where this diversity condition comes from because it is a cross-cutting issue also in art. There are a number of situations regarding the community and how the community works, how it operates in the art, in the field of art. An artist produces in one place, and as part of its retribution is to be part of the credits of the exhibition. And then the exhibition is the goal of the whole artistic process, like the natural objective or goal of any artistic process. And in that relationship, we also have the issue of visibility, the importance of to be or not to be. When we succeed in transitioning from community curatorship and communities start doing curator work, particular and specific curator work, then we have other possibilities and other places beyond what is known already in terms of contemporary art. Today, this is quite visible, and it's important to understand the circulation of art, particularly in places like the Colombian Caribbean and the Venezuelan Caribbean, looking for an integration of the Great Caribbean, the Greater Caribbean, which is very much part of this scenario. We start with this project by Dairo Carrasquilla from Cartagena. He works on this Nelson Mandela Resists. Nelson Mandela is a town with the highest racial segregation in Colombia. So this talks about towns that have been populated by displaced people, slaves, and indigenous people that built these neighborhoods around big cities. What Dairo Carrasquillo does is gestures within this community, and he built this first aid house with traditional medicine to complement or to overcome the absence of the state in this field. So this is important to define the class relations in Cartagena. This is what he does. He collects um,
Primeras soluciones como centro de
the prescriptions of the neighbors, and he brings it to this house. This was the beginning of this neighborhood, how the neighborhood was transformed, and how he works with the community. People bought a small plot, and there is a museum in Monteria built in 2004. It doesn't have a venue, but has a very powerful program at the Caribbean level. It works in different spaces that have been lended by, as you see, there is no physical venue, but anybody can arrive in Monteria and ask for this, and people will tell you, because art structures are not in the infrastructure but in the cultural systems that are their background. This is a space for a museum that has no physical venue but operates through different programs. These are some exhibitions of the vindication of a peasant leader, Chalarca, who was a peasant. He had fought in this place. This is a photo by a 90-year-old artist to vindicate the role of women, so necessary in the dialogue with the community.
These are some of the exhibitions organized. This is the Museum of Old Town Fonseca, created by Carmen Lucina Rodriguez, artist and professor. And what she was trying to do was to document any object that was from the origins of Fonseca. This Fonseca is known for its music. It is considered the cradle of vallenato, and it used to be a town famous because their people were fun and enjoyed living. And this museum only cost $50 to open, and all the objects or artifacts were brought from a house. And this museum was created back in 2015, and today it has become one of the most important venues for social and community interaction in Fonseca. Everybody that visits Fonseca nowadays goes and have their picture taken there in the museum. These are processes that have created or given rise to important points that allow us to understand the history of dynamics in the Caribbean. This is person coming to visit, learning about the life of Fonseca, which was also famous not only for its music but also for its cotton plantations, the so-called white gold. This is an artist from La Guajira in the border with Venezuela, and this artist visits and travels all over the area and organizes workshops. He's a Guayu artist, and he's very famous in Colombia nowadays. And he's also the result of some of the laboratories we organize in the Caribbean, and he's constantly chatting with communities He is always traveling, and this is an important part of his artistic expression, traveling and documenting that dialogue and sharing his travel experiences with people, because the Guayu culture has been stigmatized and ignored and neglected. So he travels all over the area, visiting those communities and disseminating the art of the Guayus. This is the collective of Montes de Maria 21, which created this community and created the traveling museum of Mochuelo, which was collecting information about all and documenting all the violence in these territories to facilitate the peace process in Colombia. And they also created a very important and famous community film festival, FAMA, to change the view and raise awareness on violence. This is the traveling museum, the film festival. This is the Yosokwi collective, Amado Villafaña, and it is very important because this is one of the first or pioneering collectives for the production of audiovisuals by the communities of the Santa Marta mountain range or Sierra Nevada. And yesterday you were referring to indigenous art because Amado had an internal struggle with his own community due to the implementation of audiovisual projects. He was rejected for many years, but after 12 years he was accepted within his community, and this has to do with the future problems art indigenous mobility will face when indigenous art moves and is uprooted from its original communities. There was talk about the suicide yesterday. He had been rejected by his indigenous community, and this has not been established, but there's some discussion and some internal rejection in the community. The return of indigenous artists to their place of origin is quite conflicting. They go away from their communities to disseminate the art of their communities, but returning to their communities and reconciling these interests in disseminating indigenous art with the worldview of indigenous communities is often conflicting for some artists. And these are the Mampuhang weaving women. They were displaced from Mampuhan, and as a result, they launched a struggle, and through some healing workshops and laboratory, they use knitting and weaving as therapy to recover from violence, gender-based violence. They even received an international award, and with the money they bought a plot, and they have now created the Museum of Art and Memoirs of Mampuhan, where they make all the story about the displacement and violence of Mampuhan, because often violence and the struggle for the land and memory becomes sort of mummified. Colonial technology wants to distort our memories, and and memory and memoirs can be destroyed and reconstructed and recreated. And I want to leave you with this quote: paradoxically, when art has paid greater attention to its relation with the audience, it is isolating itself, and you often are left talking to yourself, and that is important. The divisions of art education compared to curatorship divisions were smaller, but today they are complex spaces to study and review and analyze with audiences and visitors. And we try to establish dialogue with communities, but often we are left in a rather endogenous niche, and therefore we are rethinking spaces that might seem linear from their construction. So in my work, I like to understand curatorship as a cultural praxis linked to the fishermen, to dismantle the notion of curators as guardians, sheriffs, or commissioners. Actually, somebody should also take care of curators, and we are interacting with communities and with people involved in an actual praxis, because the thing with decolonial discourse is that anybody can talk about a decolonial discourse, and you can even do it using artificial intelligence, and nobody should be upset. But your daily practice and community daily practice is where you should carry on your decolonizing struggle. Any smart person can come up with an interesting decolonial discourse. I think we should go back and review what's happening in our territories at local level. This also has to do with the emergence of the figure of international curator and global curator who knew everything and knew nothing ultimately. And people should go back to their local area and reinvent themselves. We should rethink what's the notion of community, curator, and curatorship in a very practical and down-to-earth relationship with local communities. And I think that is the best decolonial work you can do on the ground. If there is curatorship in the midst of the economic crisis for the organization of biennials. Virtual biennials has allowed us to create virtual curatorship. Mobility was also thought of from these research places, and they have succeeded. And this has created a rather static map, a picture. You see an indigenous art whose work was launched here, and the following day you see them all over the place. But behind this, there's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of teams working, and I think the work of curators and fishermen is to showcase life relations that go beyond art and could help us give a more consistent and effective response in our decolonial struggle. Thank you, Jaime. I think the Caribbean is one and several at the same time. And there are several definitions of the Caribbean, and we use the best definition of the Caribbean that best suits our interests. But that's why you're here. That's why you're invited. We perhaps may use one concept of the Caribbean in the academic media and in the curating environment. Well, you have talked about the Colombian Caribbean, and you have touched upon a very current issue. We have very little time left. We started late, and we still have one more presentation and the documentary feature by Martorell. Somebody has to make a question or a comment, but very briefly, please.
Nadie, yo solo
Well, nobody? Well, I just want to ask you a question, which is a concern I have. How? I am worried about the banalization in some contexts about community practice. How can we avoid that community practice loses its true meaning and are hijacked by the official discourse? I think that when we help communities to create new experiences on site and people come and visit those communities that could distort everything around them. For example, the Mampuhan Museum is very far away. And for us, is a remote place that has very little to do with us. Why are you going to go to Mampuhang? But today we are mobilizing audiences through a number of activities and projects. We have El Chinchorro project, which is seeking for all those rural areas to mobilize and visit those museums. Juana, for example, Juan Hernandez told us, who's the director of the Mampuhan Museum and of the knitting and weaving women. He said, well, this is a forum for justice and peace. And when some visitors arrived into the museum and there was a lot of discussion about peace in Colombia, the referendum, and we are known for voting against peace. When she showed them the museum, many of them lowered their heads and were embarrassed. And that is a powerful vindication act. And if you go to Mampuhan, they cannot believe that such an atrocious thing is happening just 2 hours away from Bogota. And when we go and see those places with our own eyes, we gain awareness and are moved and sensitized. We thank you on behalf of the biennial.
Disculpa, Roy. Disculpa, adelante. Hola, muy.
Very good presentation. I'm Royce Smith. I'm the dean of the School of Arts of the State University of California in Long Beach. And I'm also a curator, an international curator. I just want to test your phrase or identity because I'm allegedly an international curator, but I am not a curator, a parachute curator.
Yo creo que
I think that the term that distinguishes is commitment. That is the word that makes a difference. That is the sense of a curator that wants to have a project, that wants to call the attention on a specific project, but not simply organize a biennial or an exhibition and then go back and move on to the next project. This sense of commitment or genuine commitment of an international curator should go back, should repeat, should fish, yes, but have to ask for help to fish, because perhaps I don't know what is the best season, where is the best area you can find the best fish. You have to communicate with the local fishermen, and that is the importance of our work. So I don't know. I love that you are making those specific presentations, but please know there are international curators that have a conscience and have a different way of doing things. And thanks to the Havana Biennial, I'm able to do so. Since I've been coming to Cuba since 2012 to learn and change my perspective and to become a better curator. And this is closely linked to the biennial and to the theoretical event, and the fact that the biennial has always welcomed everyone throughout its history. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think that, yes, commitment is a term that often is linked to a task. There are commitments at different levels, but you cannot feel commitment with something that is not relevant for you, or something you don't identify with or empathize with. Yes, X publishes something in favor of, to advocate for freedom, for this or that, and then you meet a community, and that's a good thing. And yes, that is a type of commitment, the moral duty that you have, and you feel forced to say something. But what we often see in communities and at community level is that the commitment is the result of people's needs, and those needs are not there. And if you don't mobilize all those values that are growing, I think this goes beyond terms like commitment. Everybody is committed with something, making them visible, holding an exhibition here and there. And perhaps you won't be exhibited. And that's the power of communities. They don't fear that they might not be exhibited, or because the exhibition and the channel and the relations brought about by exhibitions and visibility. Communities are not afraid of not being visible, but still they create a powerful network of relations within their communities. And we shouldn't be naive and romantic to think that communities are harmonic. No, this is the result of a chaos and conflicts and struggle. I love Frantz Fanon because Fanon gives a psychiatric dimension to violence. We can destigmatize violence because violence has also led to the creation of a language in the Caribbean. It's been one of the most powerful things that has impacted our Caribbean. And I say this in Colombia, and people will tell me, but how come are you going to promote violence in Colombia? That's not what I'm saying. This violence has been rampant in all these areas, and those systems are based in a violent past and present. So we should avoid violence from any naive and romantic view through community practices, and thus you will be able to understand the work of many artists living and creating in those communities, and you will do away with any ideal model, and you will create genuine and more effective relations, because exhibitions is something that people don't care too much about, because they see it as something also limited. And I do believe that community actions are the future and should be the artistic dimension of the future. Very good. And this has also a lot to do with the presentation by Carlos Garrido, that I think is the best ending possible for your presentation. Can I speak? Could I say something? Oh, sorry, but la salida. We still have the documentary. Yes, something very concrete. Your presentation is very thought-provoking and gives us a lot of food for thought and forces us to rethink many things. I love praxis and community work, as you all know. But I have a question, a very concrete question. These communities that are economically vulnerable, that are not thriving or solvent, how can they sustain themselves and how can they finance and support these projects? Because all these projects entail some costs. How they undertake these please, very briefly, because we don't have time and I don't want no say scolding me. Yes, that's one of the stigmas about community actions, sustainability. It is often said that communities are not sustainable, that they always require a sponsor or the intervention of a third party to be sustainable. And there is an entire support, legal and social systems created, people who support people to create communities and then to ensure those communities grow and develop themselves. But those projects are part of everyday life of these people. Sustainability of life of people is the sustainability of their projects, and they have come up with tools, management tools, where and also the places where resources came from were also stigmatized. Financial sources, when all these enterprises were multinationals, transnationals were created, and they have to make a contribution, a social responsibility, and they have to make a contribution to the areas in which they operate. Communities were stigmatized because they were using multinational funds, because if they were undertaking projects using funds of multinationals, they were not true activists, so they were left in dead ends. But they were able to overcome, to understand that managing life, managing projects is managing their own lives. And they see this as economy recycling and the cannibalizing economy and managing resources that, yes, perhaps these resources don't have the best of origins. They may come from the state, from the multinationals, but it is their right, and they will use those funds for the best uses they see fit. By removing this stigma on the sustainability of community actions, they were simply doing it by managing life. Because people often feel overwhelmed because but now we have to manage these funds and you have to get funds, but you have to be creative. Whether it is climate change, whether it is violence. Recently, we visited the Mampuhan Museum, and we were talking about the impact of violence in the transformation of eating habits, because food tells a lot about the Caribbean and helps you understand the historic dimension, our relationship to the rest of the world. And food, the food that people eat is important. Yam, yucca, cassava are symbols of our region as well. And barter trading is important. I grow yam, but you grow cassava, so I give you yam and you give me cassava. There's a lot of things that is just our daily life, the daily life of communities, but is their culture and is part of our history, and that is what makes our projects sustainable. But of course, all this is complicated because they are trying to distort our memory. Thank you, Jaime. As we are in the Caribbean, the notion of time and keeping and sticking to a schedule is very difficult in the Caribbean, but we thank you for your presentation. The Biennial has often addressed community praxis very seriously in some of its editions. And now we move on to showing the documentary, The Happy Accident, to pay tribute to Antonio Martorell, one of the important artists of the Caribbean. We will change the script. We will first see or watch the documentary, and then the filmmaker will join us here to discuss it. So, if you please. apologize for such a lengthy morning session, but I think it is worth it. I am joined for the closing of this first session devoted to the Caribbean by Antonio Martorell, who needs no further introduction. I think the documentary reveals him like he is, and this is proof of all his career and life and all the work done by Martorell for a very long career. I'm the most introduced artist of the Caribbean. Paloma Suau, who's the filmmaker, and I asked Yolanda Wood to join us, who's a good friend of Martorell and a connoisseur of her work. I want to highlight that Martorell is here in Havana, and he is on a twofold invitation. He has been invited by the School of Letters and Arts of the University of Havana, and I thank the dean for inviting him and for making this wish. Martorell has a busy schedule prepared by the School of Humanities or of Letters of the University of Havana, but he's also an invitee of the Havana Biennial. Martorell, I think, is the artist, and I think I'm not wrong, he is the artist that has joined or taken part in the Havana Biennial the most times, both as an artist, as an exhibitor in the theoretical events of the Biennial. I remember that in the second Havana Biennial, in the theoretical event, he presented a paper entitled From Life to Painting and From Painting to Life, in conjunction with Rosa Marquez, which was wonderful. So when we were discussing the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the biennial, we invited Martorell, and this time invited to present a documentary film, and which is the one that you were able to watch now. This is a sneak preview of this documentary in Cuba. We have that privilege. This documentary will be shown later in other venues, but today it is the premiere in the theoretical event of the Havana Biennial. Thank you very much, Martorell, and thank you, Paloma, for this opportunity. And as you have suggested that you share with the audience gathered here today details or some details about the film and making of this documentary. I think it's best that if you have any questions that you please address it to the filmmaker and director of the documentary, that, as we know, it is a work that it is a very difficult act to juggle. It's a document, but it's also fiction at the same time. She invented me. I am there. I'm naked. I don't know what other piece of clothes I can take off or wear, because I feel fully exposed through her kind eyes, through the kind eye of Paloma. So I think that if somebody has anything to say, it's her and not me. Well, I basically trying to sum of Antonio Martorell in all his facets and what he does, how he is as a person, telling his life story and talking about his work, which is so vast, was a huge challenge. And I think that the best and most honest way was to do it in the first person, or from his own perspective. it is a self-portrait, and I try to work like Tonyo works. I was paralyzed. I think this project actually saved my life, and I devoted. If you cannot do it, well, jump into the pool and risk it. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I try to identify what make Tanya the kind of artist and human being he is, because he never stops. It's not easy to follow Martorell. I was exhausted after the first day, and the following day he said, come, have a cup of coffee and let's continue. And I was, as part of the experiment, I was identifying, okay, discipline. He works, so I swim. I cannot complain. And adjusted and adopted all his life lessons. In the beginning, I was crying, and I said I was so silly, and I said I had to have two cameras, and I had two cameras running after him. I think this is what Tonya Martorell does for everybody that gets to meet him, works with him, and people who go and see his work. I call it the Martorell method. His never-ending stamina and energy is like a school of thinking, in my view, and that's what I try to convey through my documentary, also from my personal perspective. And I was also exposed because we're both naked in the documentary. Yes, you're right. I was looking forward, but in a good way, because I have complete faith in the Cuban people. And I was wondering, how are they going to react? How such a Puerto Rican film is going to be received in Cuba? I was looking forward to these, to showing the film and watch it with you, and being part of this community, watching us on the screen. So most of all, I would like to hear the view of my friend and mentor, Yolanda. Well, you can imagine, these are huge challenges that life poses ahead of us, sharing several work experiences throughout our lives and listening to him. Because for me, seeing him work, listening to him, I've been in his workshop on several occasions, and we've had several workshops here in Havana. And Paloma, congratulations are in order. How can you cover the vastness and of Tanya's work? As you love words, whenever you add the prefix in, that word acquires renewed intensity. And to me, Tonyo is infinite, insatiable, but most of all, invincible. He has the ability to recover the will and action, and his resilient and in can be added to any adjective you want to use for him. And for others, I'm simply insufferable, and I fully understand them. Well, their loss. I want to ratify something that I've often found as remarkable in Martorell, that he can cover the inner complexity of his own country with all its characteristics, but it has such an undeniable Caribbean dimension that is quite impressive. The sense of humor, the irony, sarcasm, the puns, the idiosyncrasy that are not only part of Puerto Rico, but of the entire Caribbean. So in addition to infinite, and I have to write this down, an article on infinite Martorell. He is archipelagic. because it's part of this archipelago, of this coexistence of space and time. And those fragmented islands that he brilliantly can join, not only through the waves, that as we know, waves bring our islands closer, but creating a unique phenomenon, which is a map that includes all islands in his imaginary, in his creating process and critical possibility, and going over the Dominican Republic and Haiti, Cuba and Puerto Rico are always joined and combined in his way of thinking and in his way of believing, because as Lola de Tio said, Cuba and Puerto Rico are the two wings of a bird, and he's here to prove it. I love you. You are a delight. I follow you.
No sé.
Well, I don't know. I don't know anything. I'm like a traveler already. I would like. I'm sure there is somebody that may have a question that has not been answered by the documentary, and I'm here for that purpose. I can answer even questions that are not asked, so I have no problem. And I'm sure that the Paloma also. I think we are all starving, and I thank you very much for your patience. I don't know what time is it, but I think it's lunchtime. Well, it's 15 to 2. Well, we are very, very thankful to Marturello, Paloma, Yolanda. I think this has been a privilege, the closing of this first extensive session of this Tuesday, November 19, 2024. That documentary is a jewel. It is a portrait of you, a complete portrait with your discourse capacity. We have seen you in documentary in Cuba. We have seen you in guided tours in Puerto Rican museums, and we enjoy extraordinarily. For me, you are the vivid example of transdisciplinarity concept of Jesus Martin Barbero for integrating in your work the people's or popular knowledges with wise knowledge. That is the concept I have about your work. Many people here know you. You are a person who comes a lot to Havana, to Cuba. So I now invite you to the afternoon session, which under the moderator of Andis Montes de Oca, we will have the presentation by Michel Dalmas, and after that we will have a talk where Anaida Hernandez, a distinguished Puerto Rican, is inviting a group of curators and artists, and we will be able to enjoy this due to the fact that we have to have lunch. We will start the second session or the afternoon session by 3 o'clock. So we will wait for you here at 3 to listen to Michelle and Anaida, who together with her colleagues in the panel will be talking about creative women in Puerto Rico. So we'll be back at 3. We thank you all.